your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello, thanks for joining us. Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas does not appear to appreciate the way our public broadcaster, the CBC, is covering the Israel-Hamas war. Thomas says the CBC is spreading dangerous, quote, disinformation promoted by Hamas. She has put forth a motion in the House of Commons condemning the CBC, which refuses to refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization and is demanding an apology to the Jewish community and to Canadians.
The CBC is spreading dangerous disinformation promoted by Hamas. Remember just a week ago, there was a supposed Gaza hospital airstrike that was launched by the Israelis. At least this is what was reported by the CBC. Well, now we have the Prime Minister of Canada, the Minister of National Defence, the Intelligence Agency for Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France have all confirmed that this is a lie. It's not true. And so to generate this false narrative that a rocket was launched by Israel is incredibly dangerous, when in fact it was a rocket that was misfired by the terrorists intended for Israel. And it wasn't a hospital that it was bombed, it was actually a parking lot. Now, spreading this type of dangerous disinformation, of course, advances anti-Semitic behavior and belief among Canadians. It's dangerous to behave in this way. But the CBC hasn't come out with an apology. So today I'm going to committee with my Conservative colleagues, and I'm demanding that the CBC issue that apology.
The Crown has dropped a bail violation charge against Medicine Hat's Tamara Leach, who was one of the Freedom Convoy organizers last year in our nation's capital. Prosecutors say it will free up court time to deal with her main criminal trial. Leach and Chris Barber, who is from Swift Current, Saskatchewan, face charges of mischief, counseling others to commit mischief, intimidation, and other offenses. Last week, the trial of Leach and her co-accused Barber stalled after the defense demanded more information about a software upgrade that wiped the data from the phones of at least 2 police officers after the protest. Chris Carber, who was infamously known as one of the Coots Four, has had his bail hearing adjourned to November 8th. Carber, along with Christopher Lysak, Anthony Oleanick, and Jerry Morin, have been in jail for more than 20 months. They were arrested during the Coots border blockade in 2022 and face various charges, including conspiracy to commit murder of RCMP officers. Marco Van Hugenbos, a Fort Macleod town councillor, has been following the trial quite closely. He says Carber should have received bail long ago.
We have a situation where the accused is looking to go for bail based on the initial accusations of terrorism, extremism, allegations of conspiracy to murder RCMP officers, connections to Diagolon being the initial base, the grounds for bail being initially denied. In the ITOs and in the disclosure that has been shared with the accused up to date, there is no connection to those initial grounds.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is standing by the $334 billion amount her government thinks Alberta should get if it leaves the Canada Pension Plan. Smith says the federal government and a CPP investment board have both declined to give Alberta their interpretation of what that number should be. Economists and the CPP board say the amount Alberta would get would be at best half of what it says it should get and likely lower. Smith is reiterating that until that transfer number is nailed down, she will not ask Albertans to vote in a referendum on leaving the CPP. Meanwhile, the opposition NDP have been quite vocal about Smith's plan to leave the CPP. Gurindo Brar, NDP critic for small business, says it could have detrimental consequences on Canadians.
She is currently using $7.5 million of Albertans' tax dollars to campaign for this. Immediately following her announcement, and every day since, Albertans, economists, and business leaders have raised their voices to oppose this very bad idea. Danielle Smith's horrible scheme to pull Albertans out of the Canada Pension Plan has far-reaching implications for businesses and investors in Alberta and across Canada. Recently, Goldie Hyder, the CEO of Business Council of Canada, said the possible departure of Alberta from the national plan could have unintended consequences.
Coming up, we'll have more on Premier Smith's plans for the pension plan, as well as how she's getting pushback from federal leaders, including the Conservatives. We'll be right back. Well, it seems Alberta has been getting some pushback from federal leaders about the potential of the province pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan. It appears Tory leader Pierre Poilievre and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau are actually coming to agreement on this one issue. Neither would like to see Alberta go its own way on the pension plan issue. Here's BCN's Hal Roberts and political reporter Tyler Dawson with more.
Tyler, you say the pushback Premier Smith is receiving on Alberta potentially leaving the CPP is both good and bad?
I think so. You know, I think there's the one way you could look at it is if Danielle Smith can make this sort of a Trudeau's trampling on our rights sort of situation, that could help her in terms of building up some popular support for this. On the other hand, you know, both Poilievre and Trudeau getting involved in this, that's really going to raise the awareness of it for people, you know, right across the country. And of course, this isn't one of those things that just affects Albertans. You know, if Alberta leaves the Canada Pension Plan, that's going to have impacts on people in Ontario and in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and all that. So a little bit of a double-sided sword here. You know, I think Poilievre's statement is probably the more interesting of the two. It was always Trudeau was always going to oppose this, I think, and there's maybe a little bit of an open question how Poilievre was going to respond. Now, I do think that he didn't have much choice. You know, if you want to be prime minister, I mean, it's probably just, you know, the brutal reality that you have to support the Canada Pension Plan. And frankly, he's not going to win or lose the next election based on how Alberta votes. So he doesn't really need to be all that pro-Alberta pension plan because he needs the votes in Ontario and in the Maritimes and things like that. So the real political calculus for the Conservatives, I think, is that maybe they even like this idea, but they need their votes somewhere else. And Trudeau, of course, as prime minister, his statement's quite interesting because it raises the question of, well, what are they going to do? You know, are they going to change the legislation, for example, to modify the withdrawal formula or strategy? Are they going to go to the courts in some fashion? Is this just going to be a bully pulpit thing where they say they're going to stick up for the CPP in hopes that builds up some of their support in some of these areas where Poilievre's really pulling ahead of them? So lots of interesting things happening politically there. Do any of those things change what's happening in Alberta? I think the answer is probably no. You know, the consultation that the government's doing is ongoing. The consultation that the New Democrats are doing is ongoing. People are talking about it on TV. People are writing about it in the newspapers. The debate is very much ongoing.
Healthcare has also been on a lot of people's minds, especially with the return of mask requirements in many medical facilities and the first tentative step towards decentralizing again. Let's chat a bit about that.
Yeah, so this is, you know, I was out with some friends on the weekend and they said, decentralizing AHS, is that the first time they've ever done this? That sounds weird. And I said, well, no, they've, you know, tried this and gone back, and they must have done it at least once, maybe twice in the last 15 or 20 years. So maybe going down that road again. I think the question is going to be how much does this get decentralized, or just, you know, what sort of larger powers of decision making maybe get delegated to these more regional health boards. But, you know, the big thing that's come out thus far is not necessarily a decentralization thing, although that's certainly a priority, but it's actually, you know, trying to find ways for frontline doctors and nurse practitioners to see more patients. You know, the government last week, I think it was, put up quite a bit of money towards administrative support for frontline physicians. So, you know, if you run a doctor's office, you're seeing patients, you know, you spend a good chunk of your day sitting and doing paperwork, filling out forms and updating the patient files and things like that. And so part of what they want to do is get in some of these support staff for doctors that's going to, you know, free them up a bit to see some more patients. And part and parcel of that is going to be changing some of the billing codes so that nurse practitioners could open their own clinics, you know, because nurse practitioners can already do a good amount of the work that a family physician does. but the building codes apparently just don't exist for them to do some of these things. So there's going to be some, I would say, tweaks, or maybe the fair way to put it, at the frontline level that ought to increase some of the access that Albertans have to sort of frontline family general practitioner sort of medicine. But certainly this is very much an open file at the moment. There's a lot of talk about this. The reports that came back on some of the modernizing of AHS. So I do think we're going to see quite a bit of changes or proposed changes coming. And of course, that's going to be a big political hot potato because the NDP loves the healthcare fight. They love to be able to say, look, they're going to privatize your healthcare. This is going to weaken the Medicare system and all that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see from sort of a practical standpoint what comes up, but also the politics of it I would expect to be fairly fiery, shall we say.
It's clear that many have an issue with Alberta pulling out of the pension plan, but are there other provinces who, like the Alberta leaders, are having their own issues with Ottawa? We'll be right back with more about that. Welcome back. With all the talk in the news lately of Alberta forging their own pension plan, one might ask if other provinces are having trouble coping with their relationship with Ottawa. Can Alberta lead the rest of the provinces not away from Ottawa, but help all bargain for a better deal with the federal government? Here is David Lease, host of Leaders on the Frontier, and Alberta Prosperity Project founder Dennis Modry.
You're really challenging us to look at the relationship between the federal government, not just the relationship with the province, namely Alberta, but all provinces, and say that this relationship isn't working anymore, and it matters to us because it's about freedom and prosperity. Is that it?
That's in essence it. And we felt very strongly that Alberta was in probably the strongest position to drive the agenda of fixing this dysfunctional relationship that Alberta and other provinces have with Canada. Now, if you take in Alberta and in any province, what can a province do that does not require opening and changing the Constitution? It can take control of policing, such as has occurred in Ontario and Quebec. They have their own provincial police force. It can take control of policing, pensions, immigration, employment insurance, provincial tax collection. Well, why take control of pensions from an Alberta perspective? Because we overfund the pension plan by $3 billion a year. Why would we want to take control of employment insurance? Because we overfund it by $1 billion a year. Why do we want to have control of immigration? Not dissimilar to Quebec, right? We want to be able to ensure that immigration meets the needs of the region. And it doesn't mean to say that we don't have a heart for people that are displaced, but that has to be controlled. Wow. And the way the federal government is operating right now, it certainly isn't controlled. But what can't we do? What requires leverage that Albertans want? Well, we can't take control of federal taxation. He who has the gold rules. We give $60 billion a year to Ottawa through federal taxes. We get back 23. What's that 33 used for? Because we didn't get a cent of it in return. So it's used for virtue signaling causes that don't align with what Albertans want to see happen.
So the bottom line here, Dennis, is that your vision is really quite an ambitious one that says Albertans want to take better control of their own province so it reflects the needs and aspirations of that community. Is that the bottom line?
Well, that is the bottom line, and there are a number of things that require leverage in order to achieve that objective.
Now, when you say leverage, do you mean gaining control, or I think that word would be foreign to our audience? What do you mean by leverage?
Leverage means right now we have an imbalance of power between the federal government and the provincial government. How do we solve that imbalance of power? When we want something, we talk from the federal government. Let's say we want to end equalization, which is a good metaphor to deal with all of the things that we would like to see happen. So we had a referendum in Alberta, right? And in 2020, October of 2020, and that referendum was supported by the populace.
And I should just clarify, what is equalization and what was the referendum about?
Well, that was equalization was a process that was started in 1957, and it was legislated into law at that time. And from 1957 to 1965, Alberta was the recipient of funds that came to help build Alberta at that particular time. So equalization really is a concept in which funds from wealthier provinces are transferred to poorer regions so that they have similar social programs, similar opportunities. Well, it's like everything, things can get abused. And so between 1965 and this date, nearly $700 billion has left Alberta for which we've not received a cent in return.
Well, last week brought us lots of sunshine with warm weather and fall colors. However, this past week, southern Alberta got hit with a winter wonderland where we experienced a ton of snow. We're joined by the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac magazine, who happens to be an expert on the topic. He'll provide insights and preparation tips for the upcoming changes in weather patterns. Stay tuned for that informative discussion. But first, a quick break.
It's cold and snowy almost the entire country. The exception being Vancouver, down in southern BC, over there, colder and drier.
With all the crazy winter-like weather the prairies have seen this past week, it might have some of us wondering, is the snow here to stay? And what will our upcoming winter actually look like? Well, I recently had a conversation with Jack Burnett, the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac magazine, and here's what he had to say about our upcoming winter and how communities can prepare for the weather patterns. Take a look. Okay, so we're all curious about this. How does the coming winter look? Are we in for a rough season?
Well, it depends on what you like, Jeanette. That's the thing. But we're looking for a lot of snow. That's about the most succinct way I can put it. I've been doing this for many years. I've seen many Old Farmer's Almanac predictive maps for Canada, winter maps. I don't believe I've ever seen one that has more white on it. It's cold and snowy almost the entire country. The exception being Vancouver, down in southern BC, over there, colder and drier, and also way out in Newfoundland and Labrador, milder and a little bit wetter. Across the prairies, Ontario, Western Quebec, up north, cold and snowy,
Yeah.
so on.
Okay, well, I guess that's a pretty safe prediction when you're talking about Canada, right? Okay, so what key factors and indicators does the Almanac consider when predicting winter weather?
As I mentioned, there are those three factors that we always take into account. But as you know, one of the main drivers of weather in North America and Canada is no different, perhaps even more so, are the ocean currents. So the ocean currents off the west coast of South America and northern South America and Central America are really important to where the air masses, the warmer air masses of the South meet the Arctic mass, off BC or wherever it happens to be. So right now, as you know, we have an El Nino forming that's formed out there, which means warmer water, and so what happens is that as that gets up a little bit closer, it butts up against the Arctic air, and it sets up kind of like a wave pattern, which will tend to drive storms into Canada, especially. It affects the jet stream, again, as you know. So that's one of the main drivers. And actually, I should say that in the Old Farmer's Almanac Canadian edition with the yellow cover, we actually have a fairly substantial article called Current Events, which is all about ocean currents.
Very interesting. Okay, so you mentioned a lot of snow this winter. Any predictions on anticipated precipitation levels in the various parts of the country, and how would they impact local communities?
Well, that's an excellent question. There's lots of detailed data in the Old Farmer's Almanac Canadian edition. I don't mean to, dodge your question, but it would take us, like an hour to get into it.
Of course.
But I think the one thing that I've noticed is that as far as the severity of the winter goes, in the prairies, Alberta is going to see really the brunt of it. It's going to be ever so slightly less hardcore as we move east. So a little bit, tiny bit less severe in Saskatchewan, tiny bit less severe than that in Manitoba. That's really kind of the only trend that I've been able to spot.
Okay, so Alberta is going to get the brunt of the dump, basically.
That's right. Well, that's one way to put it. I'm going to have to remember that.
So basically wax up your snowboard and your skis. It'll be a pretty good season.
Yeah, right. Make sure that, the handle is still attached to your shovel. Make sure your snowblower is tuned up.
Here in southern Alberta, where I am, we get a lot of those Chinooks, and we kind of pride ourselves on the fact that we don't always have to deal with all the snow that even Calgary and Edmonton are dealing with up further north. So in terms of southern Alberta, that's a very specific question for you, but you still think we're going to get dumped on, huh?
I do. As I said, the one of the two like outlier spots is over, just right over in southern BC, and where it's not going to be quite so snowy. So how that whether that sort of bleeds over into southern Alberta, it's hard to say, but I don't think so. I think there's going to be a number of storms blowing down out of the mountains.
After the break, a protest turns violent outside the Lethbridge courthouse. Don't go away. Welcome back. Well, you might have noticed quite the ruckus happening outside the Lethbridge courthouse this past Tuesday. Well, it was part of a multi-agency training exercise, which included Lethbridge Police along with fire and EMS. Just a note, too, that these protesters are all just actors from our post-secondary drama departments. Luke Palmer, the emergency planning risk supervisor with the city, explains why the exercise was so important.
We make sure that our response plans are valid, and at the same time that our crews are getting the rigor behind it through actual response and working with our sim cells. So we actually bring in actors through the college and university, and we utilize those students that actually play roles and create stressful situations for our responders. Last night was very successful considering the weather. We still went ahead with things, and we had a lot of fun. It was in terms of site management, it was effectively controlled by our fire and police teams. And then again, we utilized college students, including journalism students, that actually got to conduct interviews with our police teams and do some site photos and everything else. So it was a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, it's now where we take the learning opportunities and we improve those for future needs.
Palmer adds this training scenario took over a year to plan. The city hopes to have an after-action report on the exercise ready by the end of the year. According to government statistics, 1 in 3 women worldwide experiences some form of sexual assault. Late last week, protesters of sexual violence took to the streets to take back the night in solidarity to end gender-based violence. The YWCA Lethbridge and District says it's a reminder of a discussion that should be taking place all throughout the year.
No more violence! No more violence! No more violence!
As the sun began to set in Lethbridge, they marched together, men, women, and children, to show solidarity and to empower those most vulnerable to take back the night.
Not the state. Control their feet.
Take Back the Night is a global event. The first Canadian march was held in Vancouver in 1978. The Lethbridge event was held on the tail end of Week Without Violence and hosted by the YWCA Lethbridge and District.
You know, everybody is marching for their own story or someone that they may know. Actually, the reality is that nearly half of Albertans have suffered or experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And when we think about that number, that's staggering. It is close to 2 million individuals that have had or been affected by sexual violence.
In a tweet, Lethbridge Police Service stated that 1 in 3 women worldwide experience some form of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, that 1 in 6 men experience sexual violence, 2 in 3 transgender people have been sexually assaulted, people in the LGBTQIA+ community are more likely to experience sexual violence, and that less than 50% of victims report these crimes.
So for so many people who've been abused or assaulted is that they start to blame themselves and they feel enormous shame that comes with it.
Christine Cassie of the Chinook Sexual Assault Center explains why these crimes go so unreported.
People blame themselves even during the assault, where they think no one's going to believe me. We also know that this also keeps people from going forward to make those police reports. So it's a small percentage that actually go forward to make the police reports.
Going from blaming the victim, saying things like, don't wear that, stay away from dark corners, don't act like a victim. These are words that really put the blame onto the victim, and really we're not putting that narrative against the perpetrator.
But the good news, according to Cassie, is that there is no statute of limitations when it comes to sexually violent crimes.
We've seen people come through our doors, 20 years after the fact or 40 years after the fact saying, this happened to me and I thought I had dealt with it, but I haven't been able to sleep for weeks now.
What do we want? Justice. When do we want it?
So they keep this as a very heavy burden for themselves, as if they are to blame when they aren't to blame. The only person to blame is the perpetrator.
If you're a victim of a crime or need more support, contact the Chinook Sexual Assault Center at 403-694-1094. Well, Halloween is just around the corner, and Lethbridge Police are reminding parents and trick-or-treaters to be safe if you're going to be heading out and collecting candy. When picking out a Halloween costume, police say it's best to wear something that is bright and reflective so that drivers can see you out on the roads at night.
There's so many people out and about that it's very important because drivers can get distracted and maybe not see you crossing the street. But if you have a bright costume on or a flashlight or something like that where drivers can see you better, then that's what you should be doing.
After the break, the secrets of how an intricate corn maze is designed, and I take you on a tour of a haunted house. Okay, it's just a Halloween fundraiser, but it was still scary. Stay with us.